Rather than, again, doing a standard conference, we put each other in the kind of defense and prosecution mode to really curate out what our failures are and what our strengths are.
So this is really a dynamic way of having a dialogue around climate change and cities and inequity. When we first started thinking about it, we wanted to give voice to those that don't usually have voice in the conversation. Who's on trial is really the global governance system, which includes international organizations, which includes the political system, for their failure to actually address these issues of environmental degradation and poverty worldwide. We have a prosecution that will actually state what is the state of affairs today in terms of how they see it and what would be the indictment against the global governance system. And then we're going to have some statements of defense. As in any trial, there's an opportunity to be able to put forth what is determined in terms of the facts of the state of the system today. And then we're going to have defense witnesses and people that are expert witnesses to be able to come bring some of the issues to light. The most amazing part of today is that our defense witnesses and expert witnesses are from all around the globe.
Having a tribunal is really important because what it does enable us to do is to hear different constituencies and to reflect on what different interest groups are.
These spaces provide opportunities for us to start engaging as equals and understanding that expertise and knowledge comes from the base.
We are here because we're very disturbed. We are here because every day we read in the papers about growing inequality. We read about climate change. We experience new weather extremes. We are here because we see the intersection of forms of inequality and opportunity, racial inequality, denial of civil rights, denial of due process. We see class differences. We see many problems which we believe are connected.
Climate change is an urban social justice issue. It's not just an environmental issue, an economic issue, an agricultural issue. It's all of those things, but it is a social justice issue because people are affected all over the world, and the most vulnerable populations, which are the lowest income, most marginalized populations, are in the worst shape.
We believe that 2015, 2016 are kind of hinge moments in politics, in negotiations, in global discussions. Who's responsible for this? What's happening?
It may be a system that's on trial. And I think what we're really facing is a situation where the governance arrangements that we've got and our ability to engage with those systems on what are new and different issues have to be adjusted and recalibrated. So doing that is a hugely political issue, which means we are all on trial.
Good morning. Today we examine the actions of government at the international, national, and local levels that condemn more than 1/3 of people around the world to live in absolute poverty. From incarceration, education, housing, employment, economic growth, and environmental protection, there are brutal inequalities here in the United States based on race and sex and gender. The perpetuation and worsening of these dire conditions are becoming a reality in light of climate change. All governmental decisions and responses to those disasters are entirely discretionary and shielded from legal challenge. This means that people who are affected by a national disaster have no right under U.S. law to recover. So the potential for human rights abuses and violations multiply.
We will argue that as a whole, the institutions involved in global governance, from the most local to the national to the international, are actually making surprisingly good progress especially in light of the obstacles they face from enormous corporate conglomerates and other private special interests pouring cash into misinformation and dangerous political campaigns. Indeed, we share nearly all of the same concerns as the prosecution, and we believe that the testimony here today will show that, while not blameless, institutions responsible for governance to combat climate change are on the whole a positive force for good, and certainly not, as a whole, criminally guilty of the crimes of which they stand accused. Thank you.
There is no shortage of politically correct language that I hear here globally. All the boxes are ticked. Gender, poverty. Poor people look at the Bill of Human Rights, the universal human rights thing, and we all laugh at it because our courts and our judges don't believe in it. We have 18th and 19th century legal frameworks to deal with 21st century crises. A global alliance that recognizes the data that's produced by the poor and demands accountability will bring at least a measure of visibility. My belief is that it will take more than just the long-term commitment of social movements like ours and others in urban areas to transform this reality, because the poor will bear the triple burden of climate change that adds on to what is already happening to all of us.
Climate change demands that relationships be different, that power structures have to change. You saw that at the front of the People's Climate March. You saw that it was led by climate justice, because even the environmentalists who for a long time have had a top-down approach and didn't know how to work with low-income communities of color understand that we are the most at risk and understand that the demographics are changing. And the tragedy isn't just that lives are lost, but the tragedy is also not seeing that we're not at risk, that we're at potential, not looking at the brilliance that exists on the ground and the fact that people on the ground understand the science, understand the economics, and can redefine what the economics are. There is nothing more sustainable than a poor person. People who come from poverty have had to recycle, reuse, and repurpose their entire lives. What we find is that our communities are gentrified after we've reclaimed them and after we've started working to make sure that these spaces are safe and healthy, because our communities historically have been the reluctant host to all of the environmental burdens that serve more privileged communities.
So the housing policy in Mexico is violating human rights, multiple human rights, and especially those of the low-income population and the most in need families. And I want to focus on a very specific case. Jorge is a pensioner from the military, for the Fuerzas Armadas. It's a handicap issue. And he's receiving around $270 US per month. The total housing cost, more or less $12,000 US. They're only receiving water twice a week. Very far from possibilities, opportunities, job opportunities, although they're supposed to be owners of that, of those very little houses. Some of them, they don't have the titles yet. That's just an example of the situation. Today in the country, 5 million empty houses.
I'm a resident of Red Hook, Brooklyn, and I was flooded by Hurricane Sandy. I'm trying to rebuild the ground floor of my house. And even though I know a lot about government, I've worked at the federal level, I've worked at the state level, I've worked at the city level, I don't know what to do. All the regulations seem to conflict, and I traced out a regulatory path of least resistance for my house. And that is, fill my basement, take out the Victorian shop front, pour concrete, buy 2 cars, make a curb cut. Now I would be officially classified as resilient because the ground floor of my house would be a parking garage. So if I did that, and my neighbor across the street did that, and the Good Fork restaurant did that, and what would happen to Van Brunt Street? Each of our individual houses might become resilient, but we would have killed our street. We will have killed the social life of our street, so we would have made our community the opposite of resilient. And I say that because you have to target resilience at the proper scale. And the proper scale, as far as I'm concerned, is the community, is the neighborhood.
For some time now, I've been studying the potential and manifest effects of international trade agreements on different sectors of society and the economy. It's important to recognize that these so-called trade agreements, NAFTA, the World Trade Organization, the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership, are really investment agreements. They give large corporations power to change national laws that are inconvenient for their goal, which is to make as much profit as possible. That's the whole deal. More than 2.5 million Mexicans lost their livelihoods to NAFTA farm imports. Then the number of people coming to the United States more than doubled.
My question is, who is the main perpetrator and who are kind of accompanying the act?
When we're thinking about guilt and we're thinking about those that are perpetrating these problems, what we're seeing is sort of a really dated approach to solving these problems, tremendously dated.
Typically, you punish people for actions, wrong actions. In the case of adaptation, I think you have to punish people for inaction. You have to identify those people, those laws, those institutions that stand in the way of beneficial change.
What would you want us to order government to do to support you in your local efforts?
There's a long list, and I'm sure people have others, but they're not just, putting, it's really giving people the opportunity to plan and operationalize those plans so that they become adaptable and resilient.
What communities are asking governments is to respect their own commitments and to respect the law.
Assuming that we find damages have been done and we find a guilty party, where would you suggest we mobilize resources to redress and remedy those damages?
Whichever number you take and whatever relief you assign, I can tell you by closing my eyes today that it will not reach the bottom 30% of any community that is in desperate need of this. Neither the city nor the government has systems that will produce a strategy that will target the money in a way that works for the poor.
That is not a problem of resources. It's not a problem of lacking money for this. Actually, it's the contrary. Most of the time, there's too much money out there, and it's too much money spending in different ways, but basically not in the correct ways.
Has there been any attempts by your city government to improve those environmental conditions for the people living in the community, or not?
Not specifically, no.
We have addressed every facet of urbanization, of climate change, inequality as crafted in shared prosperity, and poverty in a manner that we have never done so as a collective human community in any format. The SDGs take global collective responsibility. So countries of the North and countries of the South are equally standing up to meet the challenge because climate cannot be addressed without it.
Given the environment that we're talking about and the challenges ahead, those changes are not necessarily probably as fast for some, but nevertheless there's something positive that is happening. I'm thinking about programs like the slum sanitation program, which was partially funded by the World Bank. It was funded by the national government in India. It has been one of these efforts in sanitation, one of the biggest issues that the urban poor face in cities of the global south. It has been one of these efforts that has been scalable. So we're talking about 1 million people.
Since you trace a trajectory of developing countries between Habitat 1 and Habitat 2, it's possible to describe emerging economies that achieve economic growth and societies that improve living general conditions of its populations. Improved sanitation conditions expanded all around the developing world, almost 7%, and in India, 33%, in Latin America, 71%. These numbers show structural change. These numbers show development all around the world. Standing on the argument of failed governance does not give us an accurate insight of what has been going on. On the contrary, Without a precise diagnosis, we are susceptible to repeat once again the same mistake of the past. National governments could not be guilty. On the contrary, they have demonstrated that despite the international crisis, despite external shocks and corporative interests, they are not in the pace of achieving sustainable development and just cities.
Despite ever-present opportunities for improvement in terms of small island developing states and their ability to engage in sustainable development, international entities have and are engaging in viable partnerships with national governments. Cities across the world certainly stand to benefit from how small island nations, given their relative sizes, are establishing models and working collaboratively with international institutions through initiatives like the pilot program for climate resilience to develop innovative solutions in addressing the intersection of climate change, inequality, resilience planning, and jobless economic growth.
Defending the role of governance structures on behalf of the local communities is somehow obvious. And it is not an optimistic and naive praising of the victim story or praising the agency of the poor narrative. Indeed, praising the poor may be just as unjust as blaming the victim. Precisely because there are market and government failures, we are already seeing an increased attention in participatory development initiatives. The challenge is precisely on us, academics, professionals, advocates, community leaders, to believe in the tenacity of the accomplishments of community of urban poor across the world and learn how to work with them and not for them.
If we were to imagine a world without such global institutional efforts as you just mentioned, would there be any way for us to address the needs of these small island states?
To some extent, yes. There is the sense of the technical capacity and assistance that's helpful from the international community, but to the experience of a lot of Caribbean countries in particular, they have a sense of what they want and need. It's a matter of the financial support, the technical support to actually help them in getting there.
It hasn't been focusing on the crimes or the injustice that's been leveled by people who've dedicated their lives to trying to solve them, but instead to these ancillary and supplemental policies that are part of the governance at local, national, and international levels.
It's not that we're overshadowing or denying the fact that the institutions that we're talking about haven't worked as effectively as we would expect or as they were intended to in a lot of ways, but more so realizing that that's been the case, how we might move beyond that in terms of making sure our current or future dealings don't necessarily mirror the past.
A lot of the decisions that are going to be made are not going to be made on the technical level, but they're going to be made on the political level. And one of the reasons that we're here before these judges is to make sure that we somehow hold the cities accountable to what have been a series of policies that have been predicated on class and race. Poor people are the victims of disinvestment, and they're the poor victims of reinvestment. And one of the reasons for it is that we have never had public policies that really mitigate the adverse effects of various different events. So how do we develop policies that literally allow people to grow the economy within them, rather than to replace them in various different neighborhoods?
Governance is what government does to its citizens and the people it exercises power over. So to kind of use the fig leaf of some community consultation as somehow that we're all somehow accountable, equally accountable for the failures of governance is just a whole new level of chutzpah. Every one of the examples that were given of governance starting to address and work on these issues, I submit to the jury, has been as a direct result of community and popular pressure. Let's in fact look at the vulnerabilities that still face us and the very research that's coming from communities and actual solutions that is being roundly ignored by government.
We are not seeing a small probability of something nasty. We are seeing a very large probability of something catastrophic. The map has to be redrawn. And that is what management will be important, and therefore the adaptation has to be transformational. And I think the discussion about the levels, if it needs to be at the community level, the county level, the municipal level, the national level, the international level, becomes a little bit spurious. I think we need all levels, and I think probably the local level that is usually deemed to be the driver may not come up to these large expectations.
I think what we're talking about here is not so much about expert knowledge as about leadership. And what I'm going to be suggesting is that it seems to me that not all urban leadership is ineffective, and that in fact there are examples of innovation and of activist intellectuals who view urban government as a site of political struggle, and who are seeking to mobilize change at a city scale. There are limits to what local government can be expected to do on its own. It is unambiguous that what happens at a national and a regional scale, and indeed a global scale, is as important as what goes on at the local scale. We are dealing with communities whose resilience has been eroded by decades of prejudice and institutional discrimination. We also know that those inequalities are embedded in the very mechanisms of urban management. And so that if we're going to change the way that our cities are organized, we have to engage in the technical detail. This is not technocratic intervention. This is politics.
The frequency of heat waves is probably going to triple with 5 to 8 heat waves per year in the next 40, 50, 60 years. These changes are dramatic, and they're happening over extremely fast time frames. In New York, the vulnerable groups, and these won't come as a surprise, are going to include the old and the very young, those with pre-existing physical, mental, or substance abuse disorders, residents of low-income households, members of disadvantaged racial or ethnic groups, workers engaged in recovery efforts in and around these heat wave events, and those with weak social networks. That the view of resilience currently operating at the level of NYC government, at the level of the US government, and in many places around the world is very much focused on recovery. Resilience isn't about returning. Resilience is about having the adaptive capacity to deal with the reality of climate change and other pressures.
We know a lot about which communities are ecologically and socially vulnerable, and a whole lot less about how to help these communities become ecologically and socially resilient. By recognizing that many tangible and intangible collective resources or commons that we share in communities and on which we depend, cities can easily and powerfully help communities be resilient and stay resilient.
I think one of the things we might want to pay attention to is going to the root of the problem, which is actually this perpetual growth machine, which is called capital accumulation. Because part of the problem about the relationship between state and civil society is the state is essentially, run by the oligarchs. One of the things we've seen actually is there's been a revolt in various cities, particularly Brazil around the World Cup, against mega projects. Mega projects in cities. Who organizes the mega project? By what democratic means is it put together? Usually not at all. It usually comes top down. It's all this kind of stuff. So we've got to have all these mega projects. And they have very negative consequences for the mass of the population at the same time as they have very positive consequences for certain sectors. Well, there's a mega project which is due to occur in Quito in October 2016, and it's called Habitat 3. Collectively, we said, all right, we want to track the environmental and social impacts of this particular mega project, and we want to turn Habitat 3 into an example of how you can stage a mega project.
What you heard today from people who've dedicated their lives to achieving social justice, who were part of, who gave prosecution testimony, should be eye-opening in terms of how difficult it is for people to fully express their rights. it's not so much as that cities are the bad guys, but cities really hold the most hope for getting it right, right? Because it's where most of us are. And how can most of us work together to really fully realize the human rights that I have, that we all have in this room? One of the things that is working against us is this feeding the beast monster that Mr. Harvey was speaking about, this wealth accumulation. We're looking for a verdict that makes people whole and focuses on remedies. And one way to do that is to require that policies, whether it's dealing with land use, zoning, tax, environment, handling responses to disasters, housing, trade agreements, are ones that are fully democratic.
I couldn't do what I do in my life if I thought that in the great cost-benefit analysis in the sky, the world's children and poor populations weren't, on the whole, better off for the existence of the World Bank and many of the other institutions we've put on trial today. Our endeavor is to create necessary processes and to identify and leverage creative mechanisms to increase the level of resources available in addressing these issues. And certainly the scale of climate change, urban development, and inequality will need better institutions than we currently have. So I guess, in sum, I would say that indicting these institutions to defend themselves at a tribunal such as this, to call them to account, is a great idea, but convicting them may not be.
I think many of the international institutions could be indicted in one form or another. The accumulation process that went along with urbanization has increased the per capita income in the OECD countries by probably 50-fold since urbanization began, and probably 20 or 30-fold in the rest of the world. And so talking about stopping that is an enormous step, and it goes well beyond our mandate. Our mandate, there's lots of terrible things going on in cities. There's lots of ways to deal with them. The Swiss and the Australians have tax measures that stop the oligarchs, as they were described. And that, I think, being concrete and tangible on what things could be done is much more important than kind of a rhetorical argument that we should stop capitalism.
I don't know whether capitalism is good or bad, but I know that unregulated capitalism is just a disaster. So the fact that capitalists have been able to go to the wall with their greed is taking us all down. But I think that this dual route of accumulation by dispossession has to be addressed. The issue of the ease with which people can take other people's homes and destroy other people's communities has to be stopped. Without this kind of stability and rebuilding of community, we will not rebuild the conversation that makes for governance. And without governance, we won't be able to solve these problems.
It almost makes me wonder if we need to go back to the 50s and public administration training. There seems to be a huge problem with aligning policies at all these different levels, the global, the regional, the state, the local, but even greater problems with implementation.
I order that climate change policies shall explicitly take into account equity and environmental justice issues. By that I mean including race and class. And environmental justice and climate change policies shall explicitly be used to make our society a more equitable place to live. I further order that the new school shall hold a series of roundtables to decide the specific policies that are going to be implemented to carry out the first order.
Think about how we can have a conversation about transformational leadership, about redefining participatory governance and what inclusion actually means, inclusion and change leadership, so that frontline communities are really leading on our new direction. As we look at affirming and uplifting the rights of folks who are, folks who are now considered invisible, as Ms. Patel said, people who are considered untouchable, the fact that those pieces of language still even exist lets us know how far away we are from where we need to be.
I would say we should both be on probation, states and civil societies, as they set out and find practical short and long-term answers to that kind of problem.
This failure of governance had to be solved at the city level.
most essentially at the city level, particularly for the enormous diversity of cities and modes of governance, and also because in many parts of the world, the process of capital accumulation is not so entrenched, and there are different ways of producing cities which are not so damaging, if you want. The second point is that this process at the local level needs to work in consonance with the national and regional level. The third comment has to do with the international situation. Of course, this issue, particularly dealing with climate change, is nothing that can be done alone. And it was well pointed out here, not only the scientific reasons for that, but also the political reasons for that.
I think this exercise did, and I think people did it really passionately, rather not only from their own particular contribution, but I think as humans all facing the same issue. And I think we found it a very important exercise to move away from what we're comfortable with, to really begin to talk about what we really need to do to change the argument, to really shift away from the argument.
Both the prosecution and the defense presented very forceful cases and with a lot of arguments that really bring us at the conclusion that the very complex issue we are facing has no single solution and no simple solution.
We all have to coexist and live together. We can't say business is bad, government is bad, people are bad. We have to find a way out. And I think that's what we are struggling to articulate.
For me, the most important element for us to get cities right in the future is to be able to think about the systems that involve you and I and how they actually are built and designed and carried forward in the future.
I think one of the questions for us now really is how, with the opportunity that we've had with support from the Ford Foundation and as Dean DePaz said in the beginning, what does it mean to try to create a partnership and translate some of what we discussed into action? There's an old Swahili proverb which says, "Those who have arrived have a long way to go." And I think we've arrived at the end of the day, but we have a long way to go, and I think it really requires a lot of work. So thank you very much.